Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the work session on equitable and affordable housing and stability. Before we get started, and I hand it over to the city manager, council, I had a chance to sort of talk to staff before this, just to kind of get the lay of the land and sort of how we're going to run this work session. So the presentation we're about to hear, I think it's 46 slides, something like that. It has 4 parts, and at the end of each part, there's an opportunity to ask questions. So as we move through a part, jot down your questions. They told me that they did a dry run, and it takes about an hour to get through it without questions. So just keep that in mind in terms of the pacing. So, Deborah Campbell, City Manager, please take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I went back and looked at the last time that we had kind of a detailed conversation around affordable housing, and I believe it was in 2019 when we had a workshop. We have learned a lot within those 5 years, and so we have Steph Monson-Dahl and Nikki Reed who are going to provide us with almost kind of a debrief of, here's some things that we've learned. We know that the community has a significant challenge, but we also have some opportunities that we can seize to hopefully address the issue of the provision of affordable housing in our community. You've heard the national news. This is not something unique to Asheville. It is a national, and I would dare say probably international issue and challenge. What we will discuss are those issues and concerns that are unique and relevant to Asheville. And I know there's oftentimes we get information, they're doing this in New York and they're doing this in San Francisco, but we have to tailor our responses to the unique challenges of our community. And so those are the opportunities that I think we want to seize on and talk about what we can do over the next 12 to 18 months. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to these fine ladies, and let's get started.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ms. Campbell. I'm Steph Monson-Dahl. I'm the Planning and Urban Design Director here at the City of Asheville, and Nikki Reed is the Community and Economic Development Director. And as Deborah laid out, the purpose of today's work session is for you to hear from staff what our 12 to 18-month work plan is on your council priority, and that is equitable and affordable housing and stability. Additionally, we hope that you really understand how we're knitting together 2 projects here. We're knitting together both the implementation of the Affordable Housing Plan, which was just published recently, and also the implementation of our updates to the UDO to support housing, and how we're doing that through an equity lens and looking at anti-displacement strategies to knit everything together. So we know that you're going to be interested in some things more than other things today. We're going to be taking notes on that. We'll be following up, as the mayor noted, in the presentation at specific moments, but we also have opportunities at both the HCD committees and the PED committees to work a little bit more on this. So what are you gonna know after you watch this presentation today? You will know about our 12 to 18 month work plan, and we're hoping to get some feedback from you all on that plan. And specifically, we wanna make sure that you are in alignment with what we are doing, you understand what we're doing. We can answer any questions on that. We want you to know that this work is not new. It's actually building on the research and community engagement that we've already done. It's been done through the comprehensive plan. That is a little bit older, but also really recently when we worked on the affordable housing plan, the missing middle housing study, the Cease the Harm audit. All of our existing neighborhood plans are also informing this process, as well as looking at best practices in other communities and the research that is being done pretty intensely on a national level right now. I mentioned that the core of this work, or knitting together our 2 projects, is an intentional anti-displacement strategy. It's going to be basically what we focus here on today. There are separate presentations and work we'll do to point out what we're doing specifically for the UDO updates, and also what we're doing for affordable housing later on. We'll be talking about something I know folks are interested in, which is a new regulatory or zoning tool that promotes housing options across neighborhoods based on 1, geographic levels of vulnerability to displacement, and 2, infrastructure readiness, and 3, access to existing transit routes. So this is just the draft introduction of that concept, and we have a process to flesh that concept out more. Council would be considering that adoption of a potential overlay in January 2025. Lastly, know that you're going to be able to track progress on this in many different ways, including watching board and council committee meetings. That's for the public. And we will be talking to council like at agenda briefings, for example, to make sure that all of you are brought along. So we know that not all of you are in those council committee meetings. That's going to be the method for us to make sure that we are doing what we said what we were going to do, and that you're understanding and on board. As noted, there are 4 sections to this presentation. After each one of them, there's space for council and staff discussion. There's background. We'll be talking in depth about the anti-displacement strategies. Then we go into a timeline, year 1 scheduled work, and also next steps.
Okay. Now let's talk about background. So the framework for this work session is council's priority for equitable and affordable housing and stability. And these are really coming from the key goals that council develops every year at its annual retreat. And what we intend to do is demonstrate how our work plan over the next year connects directly to these priorities. And so those are to implement anti-displacement strategies while increasing housing supply in strategic areas, corridors, and reducing barriers to construction, incentivize access for low-income residents' households with emphasis on equitable growth, and continue to update the Unified Development Ordinance. And so what's great about this is we're seeing in these priorities already a knitting together of how programmatic improvements with zoning reforms can really help address equitable housing and stability. So in order for us to really understand how we approach this goal, we need to be very clear about what the public sector's role is in this space. And so really diving into what our role is in affordable housing development and in housing development in general. So rules and regulations for development are led by the city. The city also provides financial subsidies for affordability. We use city-owned land at times to build affordable housing. The city provides infrastructure, sidewalks, streets as part of that. And then we also have a role where we act as a coordinator or a collaborator or a convener with others in the housing development arena. But what we do is part of a larger housing ecosystem, and some of the data that we pull up later in the slideshow really talks about that larger housing ecosystem and how we interplay with that. So we must consider our partners and other factors when doing this work. So thinking about the availability of labor, materials, costs, the supply chain, the mountain topography that we live in, our population growth that we're experiencing, real estate ownership, interest rates, all these things play into this arena, as well as the other actors, real estate brokers, landlords, not-for-profits, for-profit developers, financial institutions, philanthropy, et cetera. And then we also have not only our subsidies, but federal and state. And then finally, really looking too at our community acceptance and advocacy, so the role that the community plays. So again, just being really clear-eyed about how we play a role here and how we intersect with these others really helps inform the overall strategy. So let's look at that. So understanding our role and then understanding a snapshot of where we are at this point in time. So this comes from our affordable housing plan. So just right off the bat, the quick snapshot of Asheville's housing landscape is limited housing diversity, and an aging housing stock. So more than half of our homes in Asheville are single-family detached. More than half of the city's housing was developed before 1980. This really calls into play when we think about home repair, right? The need is there because of these facts. There's a shortage of affordable and available rental units for low-income households. So how do we look at that and understand how supply factors in? How does zoning factor into that piece? Homeownership is becoming unattainable for most households based on income, and also racial, ethnic disparities in housing and access are a significant issue. So how do we acknowledge these things and develop strategies to address them head on? So let's dive a little bit into our role. I'll turn over to Steph to talk about the regulatory piece.
Well, the regulatory piece is actually pretty simple. The city can basically promote housing through the removal of barriers in our ordinances, and also through other development regulations and our permitting processes and review processes. We can also adopt new or update existing ordinances that allow for additional housing options. So we're going to be talking about doing both when we move forward with this initiative. I want to talk a little bit about how we have handled, what our experience has been with updating the Unified Development Ordinance for housing in the past. We do look at our comprehensive plan and other neighborhood plans and studies to inform changes to the UDO. However, since we adopted the comprehensive plan in 2018, we did not have a laser focus just on housing. We focused on a variety of initiatives intended to make or to improve the lives of community members in a variety of ways. So that could be through housing, but it's also through transportation, and it is also addressing things like open space. So this slide is intended to help folks understand that there are plans and studies that we have undertaken as a community since the adoption of Living Asheville that help inform regulatory changes that we can make specific to housing. We've written down the South Slope Plan and the Missing Middle Housing Study, the Anti-Displacement Assessment, and also the Downtown Patton Avenue Corridor Study, which is just closing up right now, as examples of those. And we have worked on some ordinance changes that impact the housing environment. So you see that list there. So for example, I'm just gonna pull a couple out to talk about what they were for. We did hear from neighborhoods after the comprehensive plan initiative that they wanted to have more transparency and better understand what kind of development is coming into their community and when. And so we worked to adopt additional neighborhood meeting requirements as part of the process. It is small, and I know that arguably some people may say this additional step in the review process could add time to a developer. However, what we're looking to do is balance the needs of providing that housing supply with the needs of our residents to be informed and engaged in the process.
So talking about funding, another role that we play, I think first just being clear, the city does not build or own housing units. We partner with agencies and developers to make these investments in affordable homes. These agencies provide down payment assistance to home buyers. In the past, we've used CDBG funding to provide funds for homeowner repairs. We've used funding to purchase land and homes for future affordable housing homes. And these agencies represented on the screen are some of the agencies that we partnered with in the past few years to really help do that. So Volunteers of America doing a multifamily development, Homeward Bound, MHO, Haywood Street, Habitat for Humanity, and others who really do the work of bringing this housing out of the ground in some cases. A little more on that, we've been working on affordable housing with respect to city funding since 2001. That was when the Housing Trust Fund was created. And so since that time, over 2,000 affordable units have been subsidized by the city. And so that source includes the Land Use Incentive Grant, the Housing Trust Fund, and the 2016 Housing Bond.
Is that units built and open?
I'm not sure. That dates back to 2001. The subset of that data is information from the bond. So that number does include these bond numbers that you see below. So that number may include houses that are either under construction or in the pipeline. But we know it certainly includes houses that have been constructed as well. And so what we also show here is the types of incomes that access these units. So 60% area median income, 80% area median income, recognizing that people with lower incomes also access these units through vouchers. And we recognize that these units are also dedicated through the conditional zoning process or have been in the past. So again, a subset of that bigger number is how the 2016 bonds played a role. And so with that, the city was able to purchase over 30 acres of land to be used for future affordable housing development, and then a total housing unit production of 776. That subsidy is roughly $27,400 per unit. And then we see that breakdown. Approximately 408 affordable units have been constructed since that time. 368 are either under construction or in the pipeline. I think the other piece here is that we're not the only funder, right? So our funding works with other funding to create this impact. So thinking about that, we did the math to say that for every dollar of city bonds that were invested in these housing units that we've referenced, $8.50 of additional funding was leveraged. So not only are we playing a part, but other sources, federal, state, local government, foundations, lenders are all coming together to make this happen, really showing that network and how we're part of that. And then, we restrict these units with deed restrictions, with loan tools, with promissory notes, et cetera. So we keep track of them. And what we're seeing is that within this spectrum since 2001, at least 107 affordable units are set to expire. So they've lived their life of affordability, and now what's next? So this kind of data and monitoring helps us understand how we've performed with the bond and really how our role leverages other funds. I think the other piece to really show here is just, again, how the bonds leveraged other funding. So here's where we have that impact. So really, 2016 bonds, over half of those funds were used to support housing units. And there's the leverage piece, leveraging over $200 million in other funding. So a lot of investment into our community where the city also played a role. We also are showing here how those funds were used to purchase land, perform infrastructure improvements, and then also do pre-development and due diligence. Now, lessons learned. So with every initiative, we really want to sharpen our skills to really understand how we can do better and make continuous improvements. The Housing Trust Fund saw the most straightforward success and the highest leverage, meaning we got those other dollars alongside the cities. And that's a flexible funding source. We can use that for multifamily, for single family, for down payment assistance, et cetera. So it's a tried and true source of funding where the city acts as a lender to really have that money invest in affordable housing. We also need to acknowledge COVID-19 disrupted the housing market, caused delays in construction and lending due to a number of factors, and that happened during this period of when the bonds were active. We also, with bond money, invested in capacity building, but it takes time to pay off. So ABCLT, we invested in capital costs for their acquisition of homes, and then the Haywood Street Community Development, we invested in land acquisition for a multifamily development with Haywood Street, but it took time to really have those agreements come together with those newer entities. So we have to think about that when we think about starting new initiatives. And the last piece is to understand that bonds pay for capital costs only. So really starting to think about how we are skillful with the use of non-bond funding, which could come from the general fund, right, to do other things with, other programmatic elements that are not able to be funded by the bond through those capital costs. So we'll talk more about that later, but that's gonna start to really shape how we look at this strategy, is really being skillful with how we use our funds towards what program. Okay, so quick break for any questions on background information of how we got here today. Okay.
I just wanted to check, I guess, because I think this might come up later. What I'm hearing you say is because the bonds can only be used for capital, if we were to have a housing stabilization fund, it couldn't come from our bond programming.
It depends on what it's being
program.
used for.
Okay.
Like
Were you saying the
rental
same thing?
assistance, no. Housing, like improvement, yes,
Land
Yeah.
banking, yes.
yes.
Land banking, yes. Home repair, yes. But we're going to talk about a rental registry. Let's say if they needed to purchase software, that may be something that would need to come from another source.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so then let's talk about the focus on anti-displacement. We're going to look at some data here and really understand what anti-displacement means in this lens of the strategic initiative here. So again, strategic priority alignment, implementing anti-displacement strategies while increasing housing supply in strategic areas, corridors, reducing barriers to construction. So really unpacking what that means for our community. So what does anti-displacement mean? How do we define it in this initiative? So in this initiative, we are addressing physical and economic displacement. So housing displacement, right, that comes from factors such as increases in rent that drive you out of your rental, properties being sold to a new owner. Let's say the cost of repairs in your home are too great for you to be able to stay and afford those, right? Home price increases such that people can't afford to buy a home in their neighborhood and they have to move outside of city limits. So really understanding that economic piece that plays into displacement. And then, we're looking at best practices that are across the nation. And so Shane Phillips is a leading researcher and thinker in affordable housing. And so really getting at how and why we're doing this. And this also speaks directly to that council priority. So if permitting more housing raises concerns about gentrification and displacement, the solution isn't to permit less housing, which we need. Our goal is to tackle those unintended consequences head on, both in the ways we encourage development through regulations and with protections and mitigations against harm. So again, our approach to anti-displacement is really mirroring the best practice of pairing tools to increase more housing, increase that supply, with also programs that mitigate against harms, right? That mitigate those unintended consequences so we can have a mutually reinforcing strategy that works in tandem. The other thing that is coming from Shane Phillips is really just acknowledging that we are a growing city. Being very clear-eyed about that is a helpful aid to inform our strategy. So, generally cities and towns have three paths. Either our housing stock grows, and that's again as a growing city. We are really in place two as well, growing housing prices. And in number three, stagnation and decline, that really doesn't reflect the city. I mean, I think for the past decade or longer, we've seen steady growth, right? So when we think of stagnation and decline, that really does not describe Asheville. So being very clear on what our identity is in this arena. And I would say, Asheville, if we look at this other chart, we definitely are an appealing place to live. People want to live here. We have an appeal. Our natural beauty in our area really drives a lot of the in-migration, right? And yet, if we don't find ways to change and make modifications to meet our demand, then we're going to have challenges continue with respect to affordability. So how do we look at positive change to help continue to be appealing, but also help to encourage affordability? Again, this graphic is just to underscore our population dynamics with our growth, right? So just to, again, be clear-eyed that our population is expected to change. Again, this is coming from our affordable housing plan. The big read here is just to acknowledge that we are looking at an increase of 30,000 new residents by 2050. The household projection is over 13,000. So again, just being clear about how we address this changing population.
And I'm just going to do a note of hope here and say that you're going to see a kind of an alarming chart on the next slide about where we're at with housing production. But as the city manager noted, everybody across the country is in a bad spot right now. But to say that if we do the math about needing those 14,000 new households to provide spaces for them, we can do it. It's not a math problem based on the number of units that we have been producing for the past couple of years. We just need to amp it up. It's not a hopeless situation. I want to make sure that people walk away hearing that.
Although the next slide is
Yeah,
housing
really,
scarcity
you're
is
like-
worsening. But this is really talking, so the next chart here just underscores, acknowledging our population is growing, but what are we doing to keep up with our housing supply? And again, looking back at history is really helpful for us to understand how this has changed and again, how we function in that greater context. So what we're looking at here is a representation of how our housing production isn't keeping pace with our population. So what you're seeing on your screen as, we have every major US metro charted there. Those orange dots represent the years from 1990 to 2007 at housing permits, right? So housing permits. The green squares is more relative to our current era, right? 2008 to 2018. In each of these markets, we're seeing that production was better pre-recession, right? That was the big thing that happened in 2007, 2008. It was the financial crisis, right? That really set us back. So we're still recovering from that, which is why we need to, again, be clear on how we can develop positive strategies to get us to where we need to be.
So, but to read this chart, I'm violating my rule. We're at a similar pace in terms of housing production pre the Great Recession. Tell me the meaning of when your community had a great difference between pre-recession and post-Great Recession in housing production. Like what do you extrapolate from that?
Generally, we were not doing that great before either. So this is not, to be honest.
So that's how we should read this.
You should read it to say that even in the past, before the recession, Asheville as a market was not turning out the number of new housing starts, if you want to put it that way, or I don't really want to call it units, but we were not building the households that we needed for our community even then. So, but we are doing worse now, which as Nikki noted, it is, part of that has to do with the recession and the collapse of the financial markets for housing.
Okay.
And that just has not been rebuilt over the past 10 years, and that's just data, that's just.
I was just wondering, do you have any data stating as for before the recession, you're sort of right, what happened with that population growth as far as people coming here right after that? Because I know that was when a lot of the investors came in because our real estate did not increase. A lot of areas, they have increased sometimes in double figures. Here in Asheville, our real estate was only increasing 1% to 2% a year. So what happened after that recession, our real estate was down so low. And the reason I say that was when a lot of investors came in, buying up the properties for nothing. And I just wondered, with that population growth, during that period, did we see a lot of people coming in?
We'll get that population data for you and present that at PED and share it with full council. That's exactly the kind of things that we want to be able to follow up on.
Yeah.
Just
thanks.
real quick, so given that the data is provided by apartment list, some source, I'm looking at the chart that link opens, which is also fabulous. I recommend looking at it if it's not a slide. But do you think this is just apartments? Is this single-family homes? Is this, they've got it classified by ADUs, 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 to 4, and 5 plus?
I'm going to give a disclaimer right now about the data source here.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple things. One is that we're pretty sure this is just constructed units. This is not the amount of units that were permitted. But more importantly, anything that's about after 2012 or 13, that is when we switched to a new software permitting system. And
Okay.
the data that we reported is not going to break down by ADUs, multifamily.
That's not really my question so much
Yeah.
as, is it apartment buildings or single-family houses
Well, it
or
says-
both?
Should be all.
What do you
It
think?
is both.
The breakdown is not accurate, is what I'm telling
Okay.
you. You need
Yeah.
to concentrate on the total units. So for 2015, the total number of units that were reported out were 327. And we will check this data and find out how this tracks with, like if there's something missing. in
I
it.
guess I just know, like, when we do our Bowen reports and get that information, it's really just apartment data we're looking
Yeah.
at, not single
Did
family.
you
So I
include
just want to
single
know.
family? That's your
That's-
question.
yeah,
All it
all
says in the
housing
breakdown
units.
is 1 unit.
I know, and that she's saying this source isn't really worth counting on, but I really just want to know if it includes single-family houses. if it's the whole market, because I know that data is.
My understanding is it does, but we're
Okay.
checking it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
It has a key here. It says building type, 1 unit,
She's saying
2
don't look at
units,
that
3 to
up.
4 units, 5. I
But
no, I
you'll-
hear her not saying that.
Yes, what I'm saying to you is that after 2012, you're gonna notice that there's no reporting out on, you don't see the colors orange
Yeah.
or red, and that's because our permitting system doesn't show things like ADUs, unfortunately. But the new permitting system will.
Okay.
I
One year
still
away.
think we're getting a little lost here
Yeah.
because okay, forget about ADUs. Is the number 474 units in the year 2020 a combination of apartments, houses, duplexes, whatever?
All housing.
I've
That's
just,
all the-
Yes.
Yeah.
this data can't be.
You
That's
saying
what I said,
Yeah.
and we're checking that data.
you're saying it can't be right because you think there should be
I think
1,000
right now
units
we're
in that
building
year?
300, I remember thinking in recent years, it's been 360 single-family houses a year, which was roughly 1 a day. And then you've got multifamily house, you get 1 300-unit project. I don't know. I just was wondering if it was
So
all
the
collective
housing units might be a great deal more.
I don't know. It was just,
Right,
I don't want to
what
get
we
us
think
two-way.
is that the trend here is the same. So that's kind of what we wanted you to focus on, is
Okay.
that if it's missing that one typology, the trend, and people at home are not looking at the same chart that you are at, where you can see that there's definitely a ramp up after 2010, after there's a financial recovery. That is pretty solid. And when we do the math, like I noted, and you say how many units do we need to be providing for the households that are moving here, we're not terribly off. I'm trying to say that there
Yeah.
is that message of hope. But I will, at PED, we are going to give you a better breakdown. I'm gonna look at Mark, Mark is right there. There's our Development Services Director. We have been playing with data
Okay.
for the last few days and noted that there are some discrepancies. The discrepancies are not huge.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry to derail.
All good, thank you for those questions. So the other piece of this that we wanted to connect on is just to build on existing efforts. So just acknowledging that in this past work, we also see ongoing efforts for anti-displacement. We mentioned earlier that community development block grant funds have historically been used for home repair programs, also have been used for legal services that include eviction prevention, for financial education empowerment, specifically with home buyers, case management for people experiencing homelessness. During COVID, a special source of funding, CDBG-CV, was used for eviction prevention, utility assistance. So again, just to paint the picture that we have been in this work for some time, but now we're wanting just to continue those efforts and or provide new opportunities to proceed. So with that, I think we're at a question moment, but I think, any questions? Awesome. Okay. Steph?
Okay, so we're going to be getting into the anti-displacement strategy itself and the different pieces involved with it. And we're talking about how the strategy was informed. So we took a look, as we mentioned, at the council priority that specifically talks about anti-displacement and pairing that with a housing supply strategy. We also have pieces of our neighborhood plans and our comprehensive plan that speak to this. There are tactical items in this strategy that align very well with our Cease the Harm audit. We look at best practices. We already brought up a quote from Shane Phillips, so you can see up here, the Affordable City. It is just but one piece of research or input that we have used that doesn't come from the city, but that is considered national data. And in general, we want you to remember that this is just the first year, and we're talking today about a 12 to 18 month time frame to try to do that laser focus. And I noted earlier that our lesson learned with UDO updates is without really concentrating and saying, this is our intent, we're being intentional, we're committing to this, we're not gonna do as well. So these are just action steps that we can take in the first year in this time frame. They were chosen as the right next action steps because we believe that the community has the capacity to partner on those efforts. As Nikki's talked a lot about the different programs that have been existing, that we'll need to continue to work with those organizations and associations, as well as with our boards and commissions who are pretty aligned with our efforts right now to support equitable and affordable housing. And then the focus on the first year expansion of existing programs really allows us to focus on lessons learned and reach more residents to understand what we haven't been doing well and to improve on it. So there are 4 components of our strategy just in year 1, as I noted. They are improve access to affordable housing. We're going to go over each one of these, the tactics under each one of these. Improve access to affordable housing, increase city investments in programs that help low-income individuals or families stay in their homes, making it easier to develop housing overall and to provide incentives for affordability, and then lastly, to promote additional housing options across the city, citywide, as appropriate, and that means enabling the strongest residential growth in walkable and transit-supportive nodes and corridors.
So now what we hope to do is just start to unpack each of those, right? So we want to really talk about different strategies, programs that fall into each of those. So number 1, we'll start with just improve access to affordable housing. This information is coming from the Affordable Housing Plan. The work with our Affordable Housing Advisory Committee helped to prioritize those year 1 efforts into what we need to do next, right now, right? So number 1 here is to develop an affordable housing centralized rental registry and application portal to simplify access to affordable housing so that eligible residents can efficiently find and secure homes. So work for this is already underway. There is a partnership with Thrive, Buncombe County. They've met a couple of times by this meeting to really talk about their goals. One of the things that I'm pulling from here is just to improve the experience for people seeking affordable housing in Asheville. So provide a mechanism, a portal with which access to these affordable housing units is simplified, whether it's city-funded units, and hoping to partner with Buncombe County and other partners to help do that. The next piece, this really comes from the plan and also the Cease the Harm audit, is really to improve our data collection, right? So really work on how can we collect data on the housing projects that have been supported with city resources to help, again, provide information for us to make policy decisions with. And then the next one, require all developments that receive city funding to accept rental assistance. This often is an inclusion into our city contracts, our funding agreements. So really to ensuring that there is broad acceptance for rental assistance within our contracts for funding. And then increasing awareness of existing resources and rights. So especially as these programs start to develop, like this rental registry, really making sure that people know about them and we have ways in which people can understand, find, get signed up, and having a clear focus on that piece. The second piece of this work is really about our investments in programs that help low-income individuals or families stay in their homes. So really looking at strategies to help people stay in place, age in place, grow their families in place. That really begins with expanding home repair. I think what's so great about this one is that there's a lot of existing work in this space. We've heard from existing neighborhoods that they really want to see this. And so the alignment here is great. In fact, this morning we heard from the Legacy Neighbors Coalition that this was one of their goals. So really aligning that work so that we're all working in the same direction. And so expanding home repair, this is something we can fund with bond funds. So recognizing that as well. The next piece, increasing funding for tax relief. We've talked about this at our Affordable Housing Advisory Committee. Again, we're seeing that referenced in some of our neighborhood plans. This is something that is non-bond eligible, right? So we can't pay for something like this with bond funds. So this is where we would seek to identify other sources of funding to do something like this. But we have an existing program, right, through Buncombe County's homeowner grant program. So then how do we then amp that up, right? Is there a bigger funding opportunity? how do we improve that program to ensure that it reaches more people in need? Steph.
The third part of this strategy is to make it easier to develop housing overall and to provide incentives for affordability. There's 4 pieces to that this year. The first one is to increase regulatory incentives citywide. These are things like density bonuses that you've seen before, but reevaluating them, perhaps upping them, and then also addressing the requests for a benefits or incentives table. The second piece of this is to modify the review thresholds that for residential developments within corridors and mixed-use districts. And we are looking at tying some further incentives for affordability on those review thresholds. This will make it easier for projects to get through the development review process as long as they are meeting certain standards and aligning with our adopted plans. The third piece of this is to modify the land use incentive grant program, and this would correspond with updated regulatory requirements. We're looking to create some equitable outcomes here. Nikki can answer questions about what a timeline might look like for focusing on that item. And then lastly, removing barriers to housing development citywide. The fourth piece of this strategy is to promote additional housing options across the city as appropriate, enabling the strongest residential growth in walkable urban corridors and nodes. So for our UDO updates, that means focusing first on zoning changes that make it easier to develop in areas that are close to downtown and maybe already have seen that mixed-use development along different corridors and nodes. These areas are already fairly well upzoned. We're re-reviewing that right now. The second piece of this, and it is highlighted because I know this is where we're going to sidebar, and a lot of you are most interested in this item, it's to consider adopting an overlay zoning that would enable and promote more housing options or choices across the city. So we would be making sure that we look at the difference between neighborhoods that have populations that may be more vulnerable to change versus those who may be less vulnerable. And we could look at enabling a smaller range of housing types in areas where residents are vulnerable, the most vulnerable to displacement. The third part of this is to allow neighborhood scale multifamily development across the city. So I mentioned earlier that since 2018 and the adoption of the comprehensive plan, we had worked on a variety of UDO updates. Even before that time, we actually focused more before 2018 on housing ordinance changes than we have in the past few years, enabling things like ADUs at that time, but we also focused on multifamily development. So this is really the next step for us to support that missing middle study recommendations. Okay. Here are some basics around staff's proposal, current draft proposal, for an overlay to promote additional housing options in Asheville. So note that the purpose of zoning overlays is to supplement the underlying zoning districts and their general requirements or base zoning. We address specific, area-specific conditions, and that overlays can be more or actually less restrictive than the base zoning. The second thing to note is that we have a lot of experience with overlay districts in this community. So we have the hotel overlay that happened less than 5 years ago. We have a downtown design review overlay. All of our historic districts have a specific overlay and standards that fit over zoning, things like the Blue Ridge Parkway Heritage Overlay, and so forth. So we know how to administer them and we know how to create them. Third is that what we are presenting today is really just the basis or the starting point. It is a draft concept for what we're calling the neighborhood housing overlay. It's strongly rooted in recommendations from the Missing Middle Housing Study. and also from the other research that we have been reading. So I'm going to harken back to the slide where we talked about Shane Phillips and his quote saying that the solution to this crisis is not to permit less housing. It is to promote additional housing and pair it with other anti-displacement strategies that mitigate people's concerns. Lastly, there's going to be several next steps on this, and we're going to outline those in detail in the timeline, but I'll go ahead right now, just so folks know what we're talking about, and say, briefly, we're looking at doing additional communication and engagement with communities in a focus group manner in October. November is when we are looking at boarding commissions, and boarding commissions, I mean planning and zoning primarily, but we're also going to be talking to Neighborhood Advisory Committee and a few other folks. But planning and zoning has a special regulatory review role in making a recommendation to you, so they'll see that in November and be able to provide a comment. And we'd be looking to speak with PED and other committees in December. We'll get into this in more detail. I mentioned earlier that council could be adopting one or more pieces of this overlay by January. Okay, so the concept that staff is recommending at this time takes a tiered approach to the geographies and neighborhoods across our city. So each tier progressively enables more housing options. The background and factors that go into this are primarily access to transit supportive corridors, meaning if a neighborhood is within a 10-minute walk of a transit supportive corridor, they are going to be in a tier that allows more housing than one that is not. The proximity of these areas to goods, services, and amenities, we're looking both at the current and also near future, not far term, but near future pedestrian orientation based on development patterns and interest. And then we do have data that helps us understand and consider which areas are more or less vulnerable to displacement. So you can see here an example of how this could be laid out. This could be laid out with 3 tiers. Tier A being the tier that would allow the fewest amount of additional housing types. So in this tier, you may be in an area that was deemed vulnerable to displacement. You may be in an area that doesn't have a lot of infrastructure, is not near a transit supportive corridor. And so in these areas, the overlay would permit additional types of housing in the forms of potentially things like duplexes or townhomes. In Tier B, this would be progressively enabling additional options for housing development. So a mid-level range of additional housing types, for example, quadplexes. And in Tier C, which are going to be those areas that are generally in a 10-minute walkable area close to transit corridors, have proximity to goods and services, and have been deemed to not have overlap with areas where people are vulnerable with displacement, that could see additional options in the form of something like a multifamily building, perhaps up to 20 units. So we have the data, and we are looking at maps right now. And we know that we are going to need to be making several tweaks to the options of Tier A, B, and C based on the input that we hear in the coming months. We wanted to show this to you so that you can get an idea of how things are shaping up. This is not a new map. It comes straight from the Missing Middle study. It shows areas in green that are poised to have the widest range of housing types allowed in their neighborhoods for the reasons that I mentioned before. The areas in yellow are those generally mid-level areas, and the areas in red are the ones that could benefit from additional anti-displacement strategies. So those are the areas that are the most vulnerable based on data. This is, again, the starting point only. This map shows areas of our community that have access to effectively 30-minute bus service. So the areas in gray are going to potentially overlap with some of those areas that are in red, yellow, and green. And again, as a starting point, we are going to have to take a look and see where we narrow down and refine and make choices about those overlaps. So just because you're in a 10-minute walk of a transit stop does not mean that staff is suggesting today that you are going to receive the highest amount of housing options. But it does mean that you are potentially going to be considered for that as we move forward. So this spatial data really just helps us look and see what areas could be in overlay area C.
This one, I need you to tell me some more. So you're saying the things in the gray blob shape are, I was trying to do something, it's like a Keith Haring shape or something. Those are connected, those are around the transit routes, our current transit. So I'm flipping between that slide and the slide before, right? The slide before signals these green areas that are more housing ready. And so what you're saying is there's a mashup and really technical work to be done, because you don't just draw a line and say, let's do that. You have to really get parcel level. But these are guiding maps to say between the red, yellow, green, which signals the vulnerability, and the map, that's where we might target the tier 3.
I'm saying
I guess I'm
exactly
just-
that this is a starting point. And I think
Okay.
that any person looking at these maps is going to notice that there's a lot of red around those transit corridors, right? So it just so happens that the areas that are closest to our city and where people are effectively getting 30-minute service because of overlaps or how our transit system works, that they might also be in vulnerable areas. It is just a starting point for us, and we are going to be teasing out on a more granular level how this works as we drill down. Part of that is going to be through talking with people on the ground.
I was saving so many questions for the next question break, but if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to point out this transit service in a lot of ways is a result of choice and planning. We do have a recommendation coming forward to us for a pilot of expanding the S3 service. So, for example, that would open up another longer corridor, including to a green area, which is a key infrastructure. I appreciate that this is a key infrastructure. I just know that this is also about to change, hopefully, for the better.
It's a great point, and it allows me to underscore one thing, and that is that people move. This data is going to change in 5 years. People get different jobs. That may impact whether, like their incomes are part of what decides whether or not they're in a red, green, or yellow area. Our transit system may expand. And so it's really important as we consider zoning, any regulatory change or zoning, that what might have fit a community 10 years ago may no longer be applicable today. But this is something that we're doing for today.
It would also signal to me that this is one of the reasons why the downtown circulator is a further out recommendation of the transit master plan, because that area has more transit service than other parts of the city that have little or none. So if we want to sync up our infrastructure resources and our limited funding to go farther with our housing planning, then how you get to the housing is also important, just for the record.
Okay, that was the starting point. I mentioned this is a multi-part process. There's going to be steps in this. We're going to be engaging with impacted communities, boards and commissions. We already feel like we have a really strong starting point with the work plan that we're outlining here today, and with the concept that we've shown you. It's based on our plans that are adopted. It's based on the studies and the reports. So that engagement, I need to temper it and say a lot of it is really access and transparency around this information. How do people know when the review of this is happening at PED? How do people know how to come to Planning and Zoning Commission and give public comment? It will be more than that, of course, and will include focus groups with key individuals, especially neighborhood leaders. But in order for us to get this done in a timely manner, we feel like we have great direction from you, and we're gonna be starting to draft the amendments. There's two parts to it. For an overlay, you have to have the text amendment, and then you have to have the map amendment, and you will need to take action on both. And in general, knowing that you can actually nail down the text amendment first and worry about the map on a concurrent path, but adopt the map later or in phases. For example, you could adopt tier C and then adopt tier B and tier A. Should be a way that we can get some things done on a time frame that aligns with the work that we're trying to accomplish here in this year. So I'm just going to repeat a couple things here, is that there's two parts to it. There's a text amendment. That's an amendment that would say things like, if you are in tier A, you are allowed to do X, you're allowed to do Y, and you're allowed to do Z. And then there's the actual map. What that also means, this is new, is that you could change that map and change those areas of the map in future years. So I'm trying to tie this in with a comment around people change, people move. That map is not going to be relevant 10 years from now. So we will absolutely be providing you with frequent updates prior to filing for any of these. And there is a pretty big advertising process and, of course, the review process. The way that we'll be moving forward, I mentioned earlier, is that for this item, for regulatory items, we will be at the Planning and Economic Development Committee of City Council, but we will make sure that full council is brought along by speaking about this at the council agenda briefings. So I mentioned the neighborhood housing overlay standards as a text amendment first, and then the map could be finalized when there is agreement on that item. So it could be at the same time, or it could be a month or two later.
I have a question. Is it, yep, time for questions. So I'm noticing on the mapping considerations slide that has the red areas. It says red areas that are most vulnerable and could see benefit from the recommended anti-displacement strategies. Does that then mean that it is your expectation or goal that the anti-displacement strategies mentioned in an earlier portion would primarily be utilized in these areas? Or do we intend to utilize those anti-displacement strategies like rental assistance, home repairs all over? Or is there a focused approach to the red areas?
It's a great question, because I think that it should be a focus, because again, if we're trying to be skillful on how we do this, it's something that we should consider. I think the criteria that we know we'll have to follow is that we'll have to target low to moderate income people. And so that is the criteria, but again, how we do marketing and outreach can really be reflective of our goals here.
And is there also any consideration for the length of time that one's family has resided in a home?
I think those are great questions to really help inform an entire approach to home repair, for example, and how we collect data on doing outreach, just thinking through all those pieces to ensure that we are having the outcomes that we want to see. And again, it's helpful to acknowledge the HCD connection where we can really dive into some of that.
Okay, thanks.
And the only thing I would like to say, I'm really happy to hear that basically that you will be going into the communities and sort of providing, the information so they can make informed decisions. And so that to me is very important, that everyone gets the information and not just a few.
I have a couple things. That Antoinette, your point made me think tier A needs to go first. But if we're literally, what I heard earlier was we could start with tier C first, but we need to put the displacement in place first, or we need to leverage them, and let's go. Let's just go all together, and make it comprehensive.
Because actually, I was thinking that's where you were going when you were saying the timing. So the green areas first. When
So
I'm looking at the map.
Staff is gonna recommend that you adopt all of them at once, and that is gonna be a discussion that you all have about what is appropriate, you think, from a policy perspective.
Mhm.
But as we are developing this, it is pretty clear that the recommendations from Missing Middle and other places say that, if you wanna make sure that you don't have unintended consequences and changing, really skewing land valuation prices, and you're also really trying to promote additional housing, you want to promote it everywhere. But that is a conversation for you all to have.
So explain to me more than how the green areas would skew when theoretically those are some of the most expensive areas in the city. But I'm spatially challenged too, so when I see the red, in my mind, I think I know those neighborhoods, but it might not be what I'm thinking. But I'm thinking green is going towards Woodfin and Beaver Lake and Beaver Dam. So explain.
And West Asheville and East Asheville.
So explain
And
how,
South.
So I am
but
going to
part of East
explain.
Asheville, I'm thinking that is vulnerable is
That's
Oakley,
Oakley. That looks like Oakley.
right?
Yeah.
That's correct.
So I'm thinking,
It's part of
Green, that
Shiloh
might be
and
the first place
Oakley,
to
most of
absorb it.
the
No?
south side, part of Montford, the historic Stumptown neighborhood. Those are the areas that have been called out in this specific map. One thing I can tell you about this data is that also consider the level of infill development that has already happened. So there are places, for example, in West Asheville, people in the community might be looking at this map and they would say, I think that we might be vulnerable to displacement. I'm looking around and I'm looking at the population of my neighborhood. And it may be true, but it may also be that their neighborhood has already seen so much infill in the past 20 years that the ability for people to redevelop the lots is way lower.
and also, since you mentioned West Asheville, actually the only reason West Asheville isn't in the red is that the displacement is complete.
Right,
That's correct.
right.
So
It's not a great thing to say, but that is correct.
That's true. I guess when I was thinking about timelines and tiers, which, let me back up and say I love all this thinking. This has been magnificent so far. This is great work. And I love how you're tying it all together. With the timing for me in my brain, I was thinking that the tools and resources that the red areas need, the tier A will take significant time to get in place and get into productivity, whether it's down payment assistance or home, it just takes time to administer. Whereas some of the other stuff where we're talking about in tier C is kind of known and in progress around upzoning some areas and infill. So I guess I was thinking that's why the priority of timing was different, but maybe y'all can speak to that more, because why do it all at once? And
Doing it all at once allows there to be a level playing field for development within the city. That's one reason, right? So if we were to say, hey, I'm going to use the hotel overlay as an example. We basically put an overlay in parts of downtown and said that large hotels are permitted in certain areas. It changed the land valuation for those areas, and it changed the pattern of development significantly. So as a reminder, some of what we're trying to accomplish here is to give existing homeowners in areas an opportunity for them to develop and to provide more housing options in the areas that they are in. If we only choose one area to say this is the area where people get to do it, some people will lose out.
So my way of thinking is actually maybe just the opposite. Because I would think
there's
that,
an
well,
argument, yes.
well, no, correct me in my thinking, because you know more about this than I do. My thought of anti-displacement is we are intrinsically saying we don't want an even playing field
because an even playing field is more likely disadvantageous to certain areas.
But remember that,
But help me if no one else is thinking that
Yeah, I'm
way.
hearing equality, not equity, but.
Right, so again, I'm hearing equality,
The-
not equity. Better way to
Tell
say
us
it.
more what you mean by even.
and
playing
also,
field.
even playing field is not going to be the same in those areas. So it's striking a balance, right? We're not saying that every area would, across the city, would all be allowed to have multifamily units on, of 20 and under. We're saying that some would, right? But we're also not saying that there's no change anywhere else. So it's not necessarily even in the sense that everybody gets to benefit in the same way. It's appropriate. So everyone is going to be able to get to benefit based on where they are, geography, locational efficiencies, close to transit, close to goods and services. That's what our comprehensive plan says is more appropriate for us to look at infill development in those areas.
And whenever I hear the transit portion, I always have to catch myself, because historically, the reason certain transit lines are in place and not in others is because there was a desire to not enable folks living in certain areas to get to other places. So then when we loop around and go, we're not going to develop in those areas that don't have continuous transit service, we're kind of feeding into a relic of the past that says, let's not develop in those neighborhoods even now. Just something I always think of when I hear the transit.
It's great input, and that's why we are recommending as staff that there is an ability to increase housing options across the city.
While we're still in question zone on this section, do have a little chunk. Slide 27, common rental application partnership. You mentioned Thrive, and I think this is probably
Do you want to find slide
connection.
27? For some reason, our numbers aren't popping up. on-
It made me think of the common rental application process that's been in place. Thrive has been part of it, also Just Economics. Have we looked at what barriers they're running into it being effective right now? My understanding was getting landlords to sign on.
Which one are you
I'm
asking
Sasha
under?
wants
Which,
to-
which project?
The centralized rental registry.
So that's just like a hub that
Right,
lists
that's-
everybody who offers.
That's why I said it's probably a
It exists,
connector to
yeah.
the centralized rental app. So are we, I guess I'll reframe this question. Are we working with those partners to figure out how this links up with a common rental app to actually help people?
I'll call on Sasha Bertinsky, our Affordable Housing Officer. She's been in those conversations. You want to?
And one of the reasons I'm asking this, end in mind, is because one of the things that we're hearing from the legacy neighborhoods is making sure that people can get access to the information so that it's available to everyone. And since we have partners working to do that, and this seems like a missing link, I just want to make sure that we're trying to weave that and knit that
Yes.
together.
Yes, so we have multiple partners in the room, and Just Economics is right at the table. We just, last week, did presentations from what the city's doing, what the county's doing. Just Economics, we got a full rundown of their model and got to see the software and understand what's going on there, as well as the continuum of care coordinated entry list. Yes, so we're working on all the angles and trying to make them all work, not coordinated entry so much, but make them all work together.
And I know that really, Just Economics is the umbrella or the container holder for the tenants network. So I'm really thinking about renters when I'm thinking of that. I also imagine this is about getting more data around the units that we have, because folks regularly will ask, well, how many vacancies are there? We know that in Oakland, California, there are 4 vacant units for every unhoused neighbor. And there's so many barriers to getting people into units, including AI being used to set rent rates, because it's more valuable to leave an apartment empty and write off as a loss than to have a person in it. And so I just wanted to see if that's part of this, and how are you planning to use this
So
tool?
we're looking at it as it's going to benefit, we're hoping to benefit all parties, right? So renters have an easier time. We would love to eliminate biases in people finding units. We want to reduce the costs of not paying application fees at every place you apply to. We want to benefit property managers and make it easier for them to find qualified applicants when they commit to affordable units. And also help streamline that process of like finding voucher holders. And also maybe if they use this system, they're also eligible for some incentives. We also want to make it beneficial to the city and possibly the county, they're at the table. They haven't, they're not in a committed position yet, but it benefit us from like a monitoring perspective, that we know the right folks are getting it. If there's a senior development and we want to say, okay, we're looking just for seniors, that you can screen for that and you can pull up the seniors in your database, right? So we're trying to make it better for everybody.
I guess ideally, this could be really helpful, but it would be even more helpful if we find a way to require it. Because what I'm
Yes.
hearing is that folks would rather accept $50 application fees and not have a common application.
For sure, and so part of what we're looking at and haven't really explored yet with our legal department, legal team, is if we have folks here committing to you all in front of you that they're gonna do affordable, that they're gonna use this program. So
Excellent.
we're hoping that that's something we can make happen.
The other thing that's tied to this while you're here, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I, for one, am extremely disappointed the state legislature recently prevented us from securing source of income discrimination protection. The state of Virginia did it for the whole state. Cities were getting hundreds of neighbors into units. But it doesn't mean we can't have a process for filing complaints. I guess what I'm curious is, when I'm looking at what other cities in North Carolina are doing, is trying to figure out how city funds and also federal funds, we can make sure we're at least protecting against discrimination in those
Right.
units.
My understanding is, and I will look towards Brad, my understanding is that we have city funding in the deal, that we can require that that source of income protection is there. And
Right, so we're talking
and-
folks that are using vouchers or child support payments or legal tender. We know that folks are being excluded from paying leases, but we're not gonna do that in our funded units.
Yeah, I would agree with what Sasha has said, in that for those units or developments where city funding has been included as some sort of a subsidy, as a voluntary measure to obtain affordable units as part of that development, this is an element that we could absolutely add to the requirement as a condition of receiving those city dollars, where, as you've mentioned, we hit a stopping point, is instituting that as a citywide policy outside of our individual subsidized developments, simply because that's something that's regulated wholly at the state level. So at least as it stands today, and we'll continue to advocate for this, we don't have the ability to push that out universally, but I do think we can add it as a condition precedent.
Is there any reason why we can't like hold a container like the Register of Deeds did for denied marriage applications before marriage equality? To say, we acknowledge discrimination is happening and we have a process?
Hey, Brad, before you try to give us a memo on this, I just want to make sure that we have time to finish this presentation.
Sure.
I think there's a really important conversations, but we are going to have an opportunity to hit each of these as they come back through council for council approval and funding, and make sure that these sorts of pieces of each project, proposal, element, or what have you, are ironed out to address any
Thank you.
concerns that council has. So I just want to, but I don't want to cut off, there's lots of stuff though that we could talk about with
Sure, we can get into the nitty gritty. You named the Neighborhood Advisory Committee as being one of the advisory groups, but the Human Relations Commission Work Group on Housing has also requested, and I just wanted to make sure not to forget to lift them up.
I had some thoughts on this section too, or are you saying you want us to get through all of it?
Well, so when we talked about this, we were hoping to get done with this at 4:30 to give us a little bit of a break before we start the council meeting. And I know you guys have to still do the fourth part of the presentation regarding the timeline. So,
I've got a couple questions for the end. I'll reserve my two for the end.
Yeah, we can do
Okay.
yeah, let's do that. And then, yeah.
And this is really just to start to recap it and put it on a calendar, right? So this next piece is just a deep dive on or a timeline layout of what we've just covered. So really just thinking through the work plan distribution, being cognizant of regulatory zoning strategies will funnel through Planning and Zoning Commission down to Planning and Economic Development Committee and then to Council. And the programmatic and funding strategies will come through the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, through HCD or Housing Community Development Committee, into City Council. So just being clear on how those track.
And it may not be exactly this way, because there may be some nuance. Other committees, council committees may also have the opportunity to to review or need to review,
Right, thinking through the
like
human relations.
policy, finance, and HR. Finance.
And then also talking back to our communications and engagement commitments, on using the input that we've collected in the past processes just to really reflect that work that already has been done by the community, but then also continuing to endeavor in that communications and engagement. So special attention being paid to neighborhood engagement with areas deemed vulnerable to displacement, continuing to use our full suite of communication channels, having those touch points with council, and then launching programs like the City Managers Development Forum, really with that housing focus. That's happening later this calendar year. So then quickly, just looking at how that flows. So this calendar that's coming up, we put a lot of thought into this because that's right around the corner. Looking at these batch 1 Unified Development Ordinance revisions on the regulatory side, coming through P&Z, Planning and Economic Development Committee, and then to City Council. That batch 1 containing residential parking minimums, development review level thresholds, zoning district updates. And then you see that mirrored with the programmatic and funding strategies. So the initiation of looking at home repair expansion, the ongoing conversations around the affordable housing rental registry and application, looking at how we partner on expanding homeowner tax relief, talking with HCD about monitoring and data in November, and then the key milestone of the bond referendum in November as well. Then we're also wanting to have that conversation through HCD about our funding resources and how to use them. So that's what's reflected in those last 2 bullets, looking at dedicating funding to Housing Trust Fund, but then also looking at how we use our other sources of funding to fund these anti-displacement strategies that are not bond eligible. So having that conversation happening in early November so we can plan accordingly. Then we keep going into December, January. That's when we get into the neighborhood housing overlay, as Steph said earlier, to talk about that with Planning and Zoning Commission. And then there you see both the text and the map on consideration there. And then really having that second review as well, just giving that space to allow for that action to be taken on the text and or the map at the public hearings. In December, we'll have the AHAC retreat, our Housing Trust Fund cycle opens, our CDBG funding cycle opens, and then really later winter hearing the outcomes of some of that initial due diligence around home repair expansion. And we'll keep going. So this is really then the bulk of the remainder of the fiscal calendar for next year. Neighborhood housing overlay, batch 2 of corridor and urban district housing amendments, batch 3, so really just having those planned out for the next year, as well as again seeing some of the outcomes around the rental registry, funding recommendations, again seeing how we're going to spend those resources and working through HCD to do that. And then at the tail end there, once we have a lot of headway with our regulatory and zoning pieces, then starting to talk about land use incentive grant. So that is just a broad overview. Again, next steps, we're really reflecting our year 1 of the affordable housing plan, but we know that there are additional strategies to consider for future years, continued commitment to engage with the community, just so we ensure that alignment. And then just reminding, upcoming for October is what we have on deck next. So I think with that, we go back to key takeaways, but I think we'll leave some time for questions and discussions.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. One, I'll just say I feel really proud of the work that we've done and that you've gotten us to. I think that you're showing us 2 halves of one whole and really highlighting that affordable housing and building supply are necessary to tackle our housing crisis, and that we need to do that with our equity lens applied to all of it. So so many times we do project at a time, and really looking at it together, I think is going to ensure that we're looking for solutions that are compatible and not competing with each other, because they're in each other's context, and I just find that really hopeful for us. A place that I would encourage us to stretch ourselves is looking at the actual displacement programmings. I see us leaning into existing program areas we have, which are great and could be improved, but they, and so the slide that tells me those words exactly, they really will connect most directly to homeowners and homeowners who live in their home.
And there's a lot of people who don't live in a home that they own, and they're very vulnerable also. And I think of, I'm 40. A lot of my peers still don't own a home yet. And I've had to leave town twice now professionally because it's hard to keep a job and being able to come back to this town. So what are we doing for those folks? And those current displacement programs that we already have really are for the homeowner. So can we look to see what type of collaborations with community partners that we can think about those folks who don't own their home, those renters? And to be really clear that, there's a bunch of nonprofits that provide services that are really good at things, and I think that we can be a funder, I think that we can be a regulator, but what are those program-based partnerships that don't center the city, that centers community partners that are really good at this, but to hit that target audience as well? I'd love HCD to consider that as it comes back through y'all. Thanks. I'll keep it at that since we're being brief today.
I have a couple things. Housekeeping, the slide, the calendar, December 24th, when it says the review of the neighborhood housing overlay, a couple of us HCD members would like to request that the overlay come to HCD as well. Simple one. A couple things, I've mentioned this to council before. I'm going to say it. I know it's not exactly in the context, but I was hoping to see it layered in somewhere. We referenced at the beginning of the meeting that the last time we kind of did this work session was 2019. I wasn't on council then, but I was the chair of our AHAC. And one of the things we were working on in 2019 was the down payment assistance for, we call them city heroes. They were city staff that were first responders that were income qualified. It was $400,000 for down payment assistance. And I believe we had found a bank in Georgia to match it. I can't remember, it fell apart.
Federal Home Loan Bank.
Yep, it fell apart. Anyways, I would like to see that come back as a possible programmatic approach to this, both because we need our first responders to be in the city, but also home ownership, to what everybody is saying. More of that, please. The other thing is more of a philosophy, because, we talked both about the bonds and what they can invest in, and of course, the implications to taxpayers whose taxes go up, and then, some abatement programs if we can. And then we've got this massive success of subsidies that have achieved apartment complexes and affordability and stuff. But when I start seeing us think about the upzoning and the better ways we can look at areas of the city and encourage density and better development, like along corridors, I'm starting to see us and our affordable housing strategies grow up. And what I mean by that is, so many other states have rules at play that we don't, like including affordable units in all developments, inclusionary zoning. We just don't have that in our state. But to the extent that we can get some of our zoning and programmatic responses to start to get towards that direction and get these major apartment complexes creating the affordable units out of density bonuses, height bonuses, whatever it is, that doesn't include a subsidy, the more we're going to be able to do all this other stuff that you hear everybody talking about, down payment assistance, home repair, protections, all of these things that I feel like we really want in our community and are where we're starting to see losses. Like we've slid below 50% ownership, right? It's just kind of getting messy in that area because we've been so hard and focused on getting apartment complexes and subsidies and units on the ground. And we've been successful, right? That's great. This is great, but I don't want us to continue to go to the taxpayer and say, help us do more of that. So I'm hoping, what I'm trying to convey here is that I'm hoping these regulatory changes and upgrades promote that such that we can do more of what we really want to do with our precious dollars, bond, operationally, CDBG, all these things. Does that make sense what I'm trying to convey? Like, I'm hoping we're going to incentivize some of this enough to really make it worth it for developments to do it and be able to include the affordability in it.
That's the key. I see what you're saying, but basically you're hoping that a lot of the changes they make will actually increase housing without us being partners to it.
Right.
And sort of encourage that growth, and that's true. And we need to promote that not only from the investor level, we can do that from the home ownership level. And we can do that with, I will hate to say, backyard cottages.
We can, yeah. It's great. It's a great tool.
Those are ways to actually, that we don't really have to have any part of it. And the reason I'll say this, I just want to give you an example. basically backyard cottages, just as, say for instance, a lot, basically valued at 75,000 or 50,000. I talked to my lender and he said, yeah, he said, we'll finance, a home, basically, for, say they finance it up to 200,000, okay, or 275. Basically, that particular buyer only has to qualify for a $200,000 loan because the land is basically the down payment, which means 200,000 is sort of a range where a lot of the low-income people in the community can actually have ownership and afford the payment. Does that make sense? And that's the problem. Sure, you can have as much homes built or whatever, but if the people here cannot afford the mortgages, and you can't pay large enough down payments that they can even afford the mortgages. So the best way to do that is to actually use this vehicle that we have, basically, that costs the city nothing, that the homeowner basically can use to actually increase their own wealth, right? But just giving them the tools to show them how to do it. Because there are ways that they can do that right and left, and that way we're increasing not only density, home ownership, pride, community. So therefore, that's what I was just wanted to add in, because I did talk to the builder and the lender, and they can do this with $50,000 lots, $60,000 lots, no money out of their pocket, and be able to afford it with the income. And that's the medium income of a lot of the people that live here in Asheville.
And it's crucial that they know and understand that
And that's-
before we upzone it.
That's exactly right. That's the
Yeah.
reason I was telling her the educational part
Yeah.
is so important, and I'm glad to see that we're going to go out in the communities and start promoting the education they need to make the informed decisions.
Well, I'm really excited for your team because this is really exciting work. In the nerdiest way, I can see how this is going to infiltrate the city in really positive ways with housing. So,
Let's not use the word
I'm-
infiltrate.
well, whatever. Move throughout the city. Help us with our housing in a micro way, but also macro way. It's just a really great approach. It's nice to see it all together.
So
I
I'm thinking
appreciate
of the legacy neighborhood message submitted to council, and the tax relief that was named as an anti-displacement. Do we know if we used all of the funding okay, so.
It's not that we don't know, we know we didn't use
We know we
all of
didn't
the
use
funding.
it, and we know the county tax reval is gonna happen, and we have the bonds on the ballot. So it does make me wonder two things. The legacy neighborhood asked to make sure that everybody knows about the mitigation. So if we have an opportunity to send out a notice with a water bill might help, right? So that we're not having to do as much different work. And then the second thing is, we might need to be prepared to increase the fund if everybody knows about it.
Right. So council, I think we're back to the key takeaway, final slide. So, I
You don't
think
have to go over that.
all we had to do today is listen to this very thorough presentation from staff and make sure that we're good with this large amount of work that's gonna take off and start happening, and the kind of, the methodology that they're suggesting with the tier approach, which is really kind of a nuanced overlay approach. That's what I'm calling it. Or if anyone is like, whoa, hold the phone, this is not the direction I want to go in, not what I signed up for.
The only thing standing out for me right now is that I would love to see more about down payment and intentional programming. But, I mean, is this our only chance to maybe give you a nod that we'd like to see that in one of these?
No,
formative years?
I think this is just to make sure that we understand that as we move forward with code changes, there's a lot of work around implementing anti-displacement strategies, and here's kind of a sampling of what they are. So I think we're gonna have a chance to talk more, and you on HCD will even have more chances to talk in depth about these programs.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to be like chasing this if there's not a majority of council that wants to do it.
Which one are you wanting?
I'm just looking at bringing back that program we tried in 2019 for city staff that were income qualified. We called them heroes. It was more than first responders. It
was all city staff. I was asking about
Well,
that.
it had a focus on, I've sent us the link. It had a focus on first responders as well.
Is this,
I guess I would, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to, I'm getting confused, if this was the program that we funded with $1 million, or is it a different down payment?
It was called
think it was
I'll
a
send you the link. It says, for our community heroes, quote, such as police officers, firefighters, City of Asheville teachers who have been employed with Asheville City Schools for at least 1 year. So more than first responders. That was what it's on our website.
It was a
I'm not-
potential partnership with that bank to be able to do a down payment assistance
Yeah.
program in tandem. And so I think we do fund down payment assistance now. In this current cycle, if we have an agency that wants to apply, I mean, we only partially funded Mountain Housing this year due to constraints on funding. So again, like what
Right.
existing, that would be my first take. Is
Well,
what
with the
existing
bonds coming is what I was
resources-
saying,
Yeah.
because what we are looking at is a year one approach.
Mhm.
We are looking at year one approach. So whether or not this is in the year one approach is kind of on the table.
Yeah, and so our bond materials do say that the affordable housing bond will be used in part for down payment assistance. Our down payment assistance is very minimal right now. So, I mean, I think just in general, the bond passage would contemplate an expansion of that. Now, how it's done, whether it's
Right.
whether it's, targeted at certain groups or if it's income qualified or, whatever, I assume we'll be able to flesh that out.
I just
Yeah,
emailed the website, our website describing the program to all of us.
To your question, Esther, I'm like full green flag ahead with this. I see a dual track where we're looking at regulatory fixes and programmatic strategies. I think that we need both. I like that we're figuring out a way to do it at the same time, again, so that there's an equity overlay looking at all of it, so that the displacement, the anti-displacement approaches are bundled into the programmatic approaches. I think the only place is kind of a neighbor to what I hear Sage saying is y'all have presented a few anti-displacement program areas, and there's a long list from our missing middle housing anti-displacement study that's one place where I'd love to hear a little bit more of if it's just going to be those two programs, and if we have money, we put them in. So that's a place of like what the programmatic investments are, where we could be more ambitious, that I might like to have further discussion. But what I see is like, at a minimum, let's do these things and enhance them, and that sounds fantastic to me, but I'd love us to see where we can grow beyond with more ambitious and anti-displacement programming.
And because again, we're not really the direct providers of those services, so we
Right,
need
sure.
partners.
Yep.
We need to have other partners build the capacity in order to execute
Well
and
said.
implement
Well said.
some of these other innovative programs. So
Mhm.
we'll encourage, we'll do whatever we need to in order to attract
And maybe we'll
that level of
fund,
expertise.
if the
And
bond
definitely
passes, is-
fund,
yeah.
yeah. That's,
We could do that right now.
we
with
see
housing
ourselves
trust
as
fund. Yeah.
conveners and
Yeah.
funders, rather than the direct service provider.
That's
Now, you
great.
brought this up, but I think I would feel stronger if I knew where renters were fitting into this. Because we have a list from a coalition of folks who do work with renters, because we have the list from the legacy neighborhoods, because we can work on things like land banking and eviction protection strategies. I guess that's the one part that's like, oh wait, are we missing something? And I think another way that we would prevent missing things is if we take this to the HRCA,
And I think
Human Relations Commission, and maybe make sure that we're like hearing from folks who are renters. We don't have those voices on every board, but we do have them.
Mhm. I mean, I think, again, our initial strategy is the registry and the portal. I think that's where we wanted to focus work. And then again, looking at, in future years, what kind of additional program. I mean, again, when we look at the affordable housing plan, it's something like 40 strategies to really look at over a 10-year span. So I think our approach this year is to be clear on what year one could look like and commit to that, and then figure out, yes, what's next after that.
Well, so another answer could be we have the Talbert lot, we have the housing bonds coming up. How are we going to make sure that we're meeting the needs of renters and setting our own goals to help address the disparities? Like, I think are probably coming up, they're just not explicitly named yet.
We have an opportunity tonight to approve the county's project downtown to bring online.
This is a
lots of
huge
affordable
amount of
units.
work. I know that
Yeah.
this has come through PED a couple times, and we've had a couple turns of it. I'm just so, to have a cross-departmental effort, I mean, I don't think the public might understand how complex it is to bridge across multiple departments in like like 6 months to really think of a comprehensive both and strategy. It's very impressive and really exciting. Thank you.
It's great work.
So council, I think, you know, this is gonna launch us onto this process. It's gonna take a lot of staff time, a lot of, so, I mean, if you're at a point at some point, you know, where you're like, I have big questions about this, I'm not fully on board with this, you know, raise your flag up, you know, let somebody know, because we don't, I'd hate for, you know, you've seen, sometimes a lot of work goes into something that doesn't come to anything, which is part of it, I realize that, but if we can avoid it, that would be important.
I'm raising a green flag. Go, go, go.
And as we said, we're gonna come back frequently. You guys are gonna be saying, can y'all talk about anything else? But
I think it's
hang in there
great.
with us,
It makes me
please.
feel very happy. This is a lot of good housing work.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good work, ladies.
Okay, so that brings us to a conclusion of our work session, and we'll have a
Convene at
brief
5.
break. Maggie, I feel like we're kind of sweating it out in here now, I'm not sure.
I
if
like
it's just the okay, we like the, but we'll be back in action at 5 o'clock.